Welcome back to the Hartford Marathon Training DVD series. This episode we're going to focus on shin splints. What they are, little tricks that we can do to minimize the pain that we're going to experience, how we can try to alleviate some of that after our run, and then some myths and misconceptions about what shin splints are. You know, shin splints is a catch-all phrase for any anterior shin pain. Now that could be a wide range of actual problems that's occurring with your shin. One of the myths is, shin splints is when your muscle pulls away from the bone. That's false. Shin splints is a catch-all phrase. So, what possibly could be a shin splint? Well, there's number one, this could be just anterior tibialis weakness. Now, anterior tib is that muscle that runs right on the front of that shin. Sometimes that muscle can become fatigued, especially if you're an unconditioned runner going into a program that's long miles. If you're running 15, 20 miles a week or even 10 miles at a time, a lot of the times people's calf muscles are strong enough to propel them forward. But every single time that we have to go forward, we have to dorsiflex that foot in order to finish our running gait cycle. Now, if you have weak anterior tibs or anterior tibialis muscles, they become fatigued. And when they become fatigued, they get stressed. And when they're stressed, you can get strains. So you can have an anterior tib strain, and that can be considered a stress or a shin splint. So how do we alleviate that? Well, we have to strengthen our anterior tibs. Now, everybody knows calf raises and running, but nobody actually really focuses on an anterior tib muscle. Very simple way that we can do it. All we got to do is toe raises. So standing there, you can even lean up against the wall if you want to, but I like just pick the toes up. So if we did 3 sets of 15 a day, or even before and after your run, that way we can strengthen our anterior tibs in order to beat the demands of our run. Very, very simple way to do it. Or you can even do a little bit of a duck walk before you run. So just walk up and down the sidewalk before you start going with your toes up and your heels up. That way we can strengthen those shins. So anterior tib weakness could be the biggest component of our shin splints. Now, there's another thing that we can do. It's posterior tib tendonitis. Our posterior tib is a muscle that runs posteriorly to our tibia, which is the lower weight-bearing bone in our leg. This muscle runs along the inside and comes down and wraps around underneath our foot. Now, we can get that by stretching our calf muscles, and a lot of the times that can be alleviated by changing running surfaces or foot types. Now, the only thing that comes in contact with the ground is our foot. So depending on our heel strike and the arch of our foot, if we have a flat foot, it's going to dictate how much stress it's going to put on our posterior tib tendons. If we have a flat foot that tends to pronate over, or our inside of our foot tends to turn in, that puts a lot of added stress on that posterior tib. Now you add 15, 20 miles to the mix, and then we have a lot of stresses on that posterior tib tendon, which can lead to tendonitis or what they call shin splints. Very difficult thing to get rid of, but what it comes down to is a quality shoe and maybe an orthotic if you tend to have a very, very flat foot. Icing afterwards, all of your runs is very, very important, and making sure that you're stretching your gastrocs and your soleus adequately. You can stretch your gastrocs very simply by just doing a straight leg calf stretch, and then we can get a little bit lower by stretching and bending our knee, which will give us a little bit of lower stretch. Posterior tib tendonitis can also be alleviated by changing the running surfaces that we're going in. So if you tend to run on the road a lot, change the surfaces. Don't be afraid to get up on some people's grasses, or up and off the sidewalk, or onto the tar, or go on a treadmill, or change to a track. This variation in running surfaces will help increase the strength of our ankles and then hopefully decrease the amount of stresses or repetitive motions that are hitting. If we're running on tar all the time, impacts can be significant if we don't have a good quality shoe and we don't have a quality arch in our foot to absorb that weight. Another thing, the worst possible tib strain or shin splints is a stress fracture. Now, stress fractures are more common in females just because of bone density issues. So making sure that calcium is high. Now, if you are 55 and above and past menopause, making sure that you have adequate calcium and making sure that your shin splints aren't stress fractures is incredibly important, because if you have osteoporosis in the family, tissues and bones can break down a lot quicker. Now, how do we get stress fractures? Well, bones always are remodeling themselves, always breaking down and building new bones. But what happens is, if we kind of interrupt this cycle of breaking down and building by putting repetitive stresses on the tibias, what will happen is we're breaking down more bone than we can replace. So if you do this excessively on the road, 15, 20 miles every week, you're pounding, your body doesn't have that ability to rebuild that bone as quickly as you can. That's something that you're going to have to go to your doctor about, or talk to your athletic trainer or your physical therapist about, to find out whether it's anterior tib pain, posterior tib pain, or is it something more serious that needs to be checked out. Another thing that you can get is you can actually get some irritation of the periosteum, which is almost like a fibrous sheath that covers the bone. And that's where most of your breaking down and building of bone happens. What happens is it goes through about a 4 or 5 week cycle of breaking down and building. So after about 3-4 weeks of training, you might have actual sensitivity by pressing on the actual tibia itself, that lower bone here. That can be just tender because the muscles and the bone fibers around it are getting aggravated. During that 4-week cycle at the beginning, try to decrease your running or change up your workouts. Either get on a bike or get in a pool or work out in the weight room for that week, just to allow those bones to rebuild, strengthen, and tighten up. To be a marathon runner, just running isn't going to be the main component. Making sure that you have a strength and conditioning program and making sure that the muscles in your lower legs are strong enough to beat the demands of the run. If they're not strong enough to beat the demands of the run, you tend to break down. And when you break down, that's an overuse injury. So overuse injuries can really hamper decreasing your running times.